I'm happy that I can announce the first speaker of today. And the first lecture of today is by Christoph Schöch. Christoph is Professor of Digital Humanities at the University of Trier and co-director of the Trier Center for Digital Humanities. He is also chair of the Cost Action Distant Reading for European Literary History and president of the Digital Humanities Association for the German-speaking area. Professor Schöch's interests in research and teaching are located at the confluence of French literary studies and digital humanities. His methodological focus is on computational literary studies. In terms of materials, he is focusing on French classical and Enlightenment drama, as well as on the modern and contemporary French novel. He is also interested in new forms of scholarly publishing and collaboration and pleads for open access, open science in the humanities. Christoph will talk today about a typology of reproducible research, concepts, terms, examples. Christoph, I would like to invite you for your talk, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here today. Welcome everyone to this talk on a typology of reproducible research. I will now share my screen. Just a second. This should be the right screen. You should now see the slides, and I will just set this up for myself as well so that I see my notes. Okay, so a typology of reproducible research, concepts, terms, examples. I will really focus on concepts, I think, add something about terms, and briefly touch on some examples. Now, first of all, what is reproducible research? Or as I sometimes call it, repeating research, in the sense that I'm looking for a cover term that doesn't go already into this question, you know, are we going to call it reproducible, or are we going to call it replication? So repeating research is for me a sort of an umbrella term that, that just encompasses any research that is in some defined relation to earlier research. And if we look at the context of this kind of repeating research, we see some other concepts that are familiar, more or less familiar maybe, and repeating research is really related to, but also distinct from these other areas. We can look, for example, just as an example, at peer review. So the process that intervenes as a quality check in a way in academic publishing. Now, peer review is more than repeating research, but it can include repeating research, although it actually rarely does. And that's maybe something that we could think about changing as well. Or repeating research is related to open science, in the sense that open science is really a precondition to make repeating research possible. Now, I don't want to talk about all the terms, so we just move on from here. But one more thing that could be said about repeating research in a general way is that there are really two perspectives on it. One is a retrospective view of it. So you look at two studies, one that has repeated another one, and you ask yourself, okay, what kind of repetition has been done here? You know, is it replication, reproduction, reanalysis, etc.? And we will get to these terms. Or is it prospective? You know, I have a study here, maybe my own study, what kind of repeating research can be done with it? So in what sense is my research repeatable? So there are really two perspectives to this. And I think a clear understanding of the space of possibilities of repeating research or reproducible research really helps also decide, okay, what kind of information do I want to include with my publication to make it repeatable in a specific sense? Now, before we dive into it very briefly, why do I think that this kind of reproducible research or repeating research matters? So first of all, I think it's relevant because it relates to issues of trust and reliability of research. And I mean, we see this in the pandemic, under laser sharp focus, how important this is. And it also relates to generalizability and robustness of research. But it's also timely to think about this kind of research at the moment, because as we have just heard as well in the summary, as you may have heard in the first round of lectures, recently repeatability of research has come to be questioned in biomedicine and psychology first, but in other fields as well, more recently in machine learning, natural language processing, or the digital humanities, which is my field. Now, in the humanities, the situation is a little bit special. We usually use something we could call intersubjective plausibility to make our research, trusted and reliable. And we support this by clear argumentation and representative supporting examples. But in the digital humanities, we do work with code and data, so this has shifted. And so the clear argumentation needs to be supplemented by executable code. And the representative examples are replaced by charts summarizing the data or by the data itself. And when that happens, repeatable research and all these issues of reproducibility become also important in digital humanities. And that's why I am personally invested in this topic. But now let's look at this typology of repeating research that I would like to propose. My impression when reading up on, on the field, on the concepts, is that the terminology is incredibly confusing. There's a range of terms, and replicability, reproducibility, reanalysis, are just three of them. And depending on the field that the authors come from, the terms can have quite different meaning and sometimes even be swapped out for each other. And so I think a first step in a better understanding of repeating or reproducible research is clear terminology. And such a terminology should be grounded in a clear understanding of the conceptual structure of the problem. And so I think that an approach to this issue that takes a typological and conceptual view has an advantage over purely definitions of terms, because if you have a clear conceptual space, then the labels become secondary in a way. And they become exchangeable because it's clear what you mean by reference to the conceptual space. And this is what we want to look at now. This is really the main point of the whole talk. So I propose to understand the problem of reproducible research as a three-dimensional space, a three-dimensional concept space. And the three dimensions, and I visualize it here as a three-dimensional space, a cube, are really the method. So what method are you using? The research question and the data set. And what these dimensions express is the relationship between your study and an earlier study that you are repeating, or between your study and someone else later on repeating your research. And now the question is, in terms of these three dimensions, method, research question, and data set, are these two studies identical, same method, or are they different method? Or are they more or less similar, pretty dissimilar? It's really not a binary space, it's a continuous space. But we can still, identify certain prototypical configurations of these dimensions or spaces in the cube, corners of the cube, to talk about it more clearly. So any repeating research, any relationship between an earlier paper and a later paper, you can look at it, okay, are they using the same, do they have the same research question, or is the research question different? Are they using the same data set, or is the data set different? And are they using the same method of analysis, or is the method different? Now, sometimes the three-dimensional space is not enough. So sometimes, for example, some studies talk about an additional dimension of implementation. So not just which method, but which exact implementation are you using? But that doesn't really change the conceptual space, because if you understand method in a very strict sense, then it's the implemented method, okay? And another addition to the space sometimes is who does the research? Is it the same person repeating the research? Does it happen in the same lab, or does it happen in a different lab or on a different continent, you know? So this is an additional dimension that I don't cover here, but that you sometimes find in papers mentioned as well. And so whenever you read, you know, reproduction, replication, you can now ask yourself, okay, what are these authors really meaning? Do they talk about, you know, same data set but different method, or do they mean something else? And I think it's helpful for a clear understanding of the research literature in this field to have this sort of understanding. Now, let's look at one part of this space for a moment, and just in a way, you know, one face of the cube. And sorry, that's here we are. So just one face of the cube where the research question is the same. And this is basically the most frequent case maybe. So now what remains is really two dimensions. The method can be same or different, and the data can be the same or different. And so if the data is the same and the method is the same, then I would speak of replication. Replication of the experiment. Everything is the same, and you're basically just running it again. Now, let's look at this a little bit more closely. So if in this configuration, where I would say this is replication of the experiment, the method is the same, the data is the same, the question is the same. The function is really a quality check. You want to see whether, you know, these guys ran the experiment correctly, and that the code that they published alongside their paper really produces the plots that they publish in the paper. So there's very little new knowledge involved, except, you know, confirming that everything is okay with the paper. And at the same time, the requirements are very high because you need the code and the data to be available. You need to be able to run them. So you need maybe the correct environment. So this is interesting. Sometimes we limit the discussion of, you know, repeating research to just this particular use case or this particular configuration, but it's really just one extreme case. And I would argue that it's, you know, important, of course, in terms of quality check. And if it fails, you know, it makes headlines like the biomedicine example or the psychology example, but it actually doesn't teach us that much. So let's look at a different configuration. Same method, but different data. So we're using, for example, we are reusing the code, but we swap out the data. We use a different, maybe related and obviously relevant data set, but not the same data set. So in this case, I would say that we are now trying to reproduce the results, so reproduction. The function of this kind of setup is to check whether the method generalizes and the results of the method generalize to other data sets. So it does give us new knowledge because it supports generalization. The requirements are still pretty high because we need the code, for example, to be available. And of course, we need to know a lot about the data so that we can provide a second, you know, new but relevant data set. Now, third configuration, different method, same data. So that's the inverse in a way of the previous one. And I would say in this case, that the term that I propose, but you know, the term really doesn't matter as long as our understanding of what is meant is clear. I would propose the term reanalysis of the data. And here, the function is slightly different to the second case. Really, you are testing for the robustness of the results. So does my data show similar effects even when I use a slightly different method or even a pretty different method to do some analysis? So it does, I do think that it provides new knowledge because it shows the robustness of the setup of the results. And the requirements for this are also high because the data needs to be available. And again, you need to know a lot about the method so that you can, you know, come up with a different method that checks similar things. Because remember, we're still in the same research question. So the perspective of your research is still pretty similar. Now, the second part of the typology, in a way, would look like this. So this is basically the back of the cube, the back side of the cube, where the research question is different, and then, you know, the same happens again with the data and the method. And I don't want to, you know, go into detail here, but for example, just to use the terminology quickly, if you use the same data but you have a different research question, obviously you will have a different method, then you are just reusing the data. If your question is different, but you use this, the same code, and your data is different as well, then you are just reusing the code or the method. So in any case, we can see that again we have these relations between the terms, and I think it's important to to think about it in this way, in this systematic way. And just to finish, if the research question is different, the method is different, and the data is different, then obviously I don't propose a term, because then it is not repeatable research. There is no discernible relationship in the context of this conceptual space. Okay. Now, before we finish, before I conclude, let's just look at two quick examples. So the first example is, and they are both from CLS, so from computational literary studies, where we study research questions from literary studies, but using methods from computer science, which is my field in a way. And this is just to use the terminology in one or two examples to make it a little bit more illustrative, maybe. So one thing that is typical for repeating or research in the digital humanities and in CLS is that very often we have to, the temporal distance is huge between the original study and the repeating study. And that means that it usually, or in many cases, bridges the analog digital divide. So it's not just saying, I'm reviewing a paper, so I run the code again, and the paper's from last year, and and now I'm doing it, and I have the same programming environment, and So here is a pretty extreme case where two digital humanists in 2015, starting in 2015, repeated a study by Mendenhall from 1887. And so here you have Mendenhall, and he published an article called The Characteristic Curves of Composition, in which he counted for a large number of novels by various English authors. He took the first 1,000 words of each novel, and he counted the distribution of the word lengths. And he came up with this kind of graph. And sorry, it's a bit small. It basically shows you how many of these 1,000 words had just one letter, 2 letters, 3 letters, and the peak is at 3, and then 4, 5, 6, and it goes down again. Okay, so this is the characteristic curve of composition for Oliver Twist in this case, the novel Oliver Twist. And his idea was that if you do this, you can tell authors apart, and you could attribute anonymous works like Shakespeare plays, are they really by Shakespeare, using this method. And so this is what Stefan Sinclair and Jeffrey Rockwell repeated. And in their study, obviously using Jupyter Notebooks and Python and digital texts, this is what the curve looks like. And so it's very similar. You see the peak is at the same spot. There's this little variation at the right side, but there's also one slight difference. There seem to be a few words that have 13 letters. And now something happens that is typical of repeating research. Now here, they used the exact same, well, almost the exact same text, not necessarily the same edition, and of course a digital text, but the results are very similar. But now what happens is, of course, digital methods scale, and they were able to do the same, not just for 1,000 words, but for the entire novel. And then you see the curve shifts, obviously. There are a lot more words, and there are also some few, but some longer words. Now, what they did, they thought also, and that's why I mention it, because it's really, for me, an important first example of this kind of research in computational literary studies. They thought about it as repeating research, but also as repeatable research. And that's why you see here the link to GitHub. So their data and their code is on GitHub, and you can start up a Jupyter Notebook and execute that code and see exactly what happens, and modify the code, modify the data, and see what happens. And actually it turns out, and this is, they don't really test it, but if you try this for authorship attribution, it turns out it doesn't work. And this kind of quantitative authorship attribution today doesn't work with word lengths. It works primarily with, feature distributions. And but still, this double perspective, repeating and repeatable, that's important to me. Now, I have another example where I myself did this kind of study, repeating a study that a famous statistician, Leo Spitzer, did in 1928 on an author from the 17th century. But because of the time, I don't want to go too deeply into this. But basically what happens here, again, it covers the analog digital divide, because obviously Spitzer in 1928 worked with printed text and I used digital text. And another trend or typical feature is that, you move around actually in the cube. I started out by trying to replicate as closely as possible Spitzer's earlier study. So exactly same question. I tried to approximate his data set, just these exact plays by Racine. And I tried to replicate his approach, which is searching for a specific type of stylistic device, 50 different devices. And so that was really trying to replicate his study as closely as possible. Although, the digital analog divide means it's not a strict replication. Obviously, there's no code to run. But then I added data from other authors, again, because digital methods scale. And so the data set changed. And this change of a data set, larger data set with comparison authors, that led also to different methods. So instead of just searching for certain stylistic patterns, I started to use exploratory methods, where you take two groups of text and you try to explore, find out their distinctive differences, like their keywords and things like that. And so I moved away from the replication really to, reproduction, reanalysis, and I really ended up doing follow-up research in a way. And also, of course, ended up doing meta-research, because you end up reflecting on the strengths and weaknesses of the original non-digital study and your own strengths and limitations of the digital approach. And so my experience with this is that an exact replication has this, this quality check aspect. But if you really want to learn something new about what you're studying, about your methods, about the earlier methods, it is useful to depart slightly and in a controlled manner from the original study. You will actually learn more, I believe. But now to conclude. First of all, a little bit something about why I think the typology is useful, or what it's useful for. First of all, it gives structure. It structures the field of repeating research. It establishes systematic relationships between different kinds of reproducible research. So that's already useful, I think, for better understanding. And then it is also useful in terms of the terminology. So the conceptual typology comes first and the labels come second. So they are not that important. They are just labels for things that we understand. The terms have a relational, differentiated meaning, because we can say, okay, if you take reproduction and you change the data, then you end up having reproduction. Sorry, I'm already confusing the terms in my own terminology. Sorry. It also helps you check the meaning of a term in use. So when you encounter a term, you can ask yourself, okay, what are they really talking about here? And so that means it supports translating terminology between communities, which is really useful because we tend to, misunderstand each other between, let's say, biology and computer science. And that means we can't learn from each other as much as we could. And finally, it's useful in practice because it helps you decide, okay, what do I need to provide to enable specific types of repeating research? You can also understand more clearly what to expect from a given repeating research study, because you will know, okay, if it is a strict replication, it will tell me whether this is well done, but it will not tell me whether it's robust or generalizable. And it helps also identify similar studies across disciplines so that you can compare how they are doing this, what the results are, etc. And finally, just to wrap up, I think this kind of thinking is also a way forward for digital humanities and computational literary studies, in that it has a strategic impact. It helps establish repeating research as part of digital humanities. And I think more generally, a clear terminology, a clear understanding helps establish an issue in a field. So this is not just true for digital humanities. it also shows how essential open science is, because without open science, none of this is possible. Anytime, the main obstacle to repeating research is closed data, not available code, etc. Who's concerned by repeating research? I think it's both an individual effort and a community effort. It's an individual effort to make your code and data available whenever you can, without being forced to it or without really needing it. You just do it. But it's also a community effort, because we should organize this kind of replication process, quality checking process. That's not something individuals can do. It has to be a community effort. And finally, how can we make this happen? I think we can help make papers repeatable, so looking into the future, by establishing reporting standards for data and methods and code. We could establish a repeating research publication category, because it's hard to, repeating research by definition is not original. So it's not valued to publish it. So we also need incentives, for example, a best repeating research paper award. And so this is why I think repeating research is important to think about, that it's important to think about it, as clearly as we can. And I hope I have contributed a little bit of helping you think about this whole complex area of reproducible, replicable, and repeatable research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for your interesting, stimulating talk. There were a couple of questions which being raised in the chat. So I will ask you one of the questions is, I feel that the confusion in the terminology in part comes from a lack of distinction between results, numbers from the study, from conclusion. Sketch of the broader consequences of these numbers in relation to what is already known about the topic and used methods. If these two concepts are used properly, do we end up with the same distinctions the proposed typology makes?
To be honest, I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but so I'm actually not really proposing that you take my terminology and use it, or that anybody does that. I'm proposing that we think about the conceptual structure of the problem, and that this should help us understand each other across diverging and confusing terminology. So as long as you can find out from a paper what they mean by a given term, by checking, is the data the same? Is the method the same? Is the research question the same? Is the implementation the same? Or is the lab the same or different? That should help you figure out what they mean, even if they use a term that you haven't seen before or that you have seen used in a different way. So I'm not sure I really replied to the question, but this is this is my take on this issue.
Thank you. Then maybe a question, is there such a thing as minimal proximity in methods, questions, data, for it's still to count as repetition? In other words, where do the sides of the cube end?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So when I first came up with this typology or this cube, I thought of it as a binary problem. So either the data is the same or it's not. And if it's not, and the methods are not different, not the same, and the research question is not the same, then it's simply not repeating research. And the more I practiced this myself and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that really it's a gradient. And these labels are really just labels for prototypical extreme corners of the cube. And where do we stop saying this is replication and now it is reproduction? Really there's nobody can decide that. But it's important to understand that, data can be more or less identical. It can be, identical because you actually just use the same data and ran a code again, or it can be similar because you got the same data but in your own way, or it can be pretty different because, for example, you did, in empirical context, you asked other people, but with the same socioeconomic distribution, but so you have fresh data, but that is really comparable, but it's not the same data anymore, So I don't think anybody can judge the limits, but if you can describe, the exact way in which your data is still similar and in which way it is dissimilar to the previous data, I think then you have achieved the clarity that we need. And whether it can still be called this or that is really not so important, I think. And yeah, at some point, of course, if everything is completely different, then there's no relationship anymore. But if your question is still related to the earlier question, then it's follow-up research. That's fine, and there's nothing wrong with follow-up research, except that I think so. The extremes are not as interesting as they could be. Like the exact replication, it's just a quality check, and the follow-up research is actually too different to yield specific insights. Like if we want to make progress systematically in science, we need to change one thing at a time and see what difference does it make, not everything at a time. If we change too many of our parameters, then we see different results, but we don't know, why, what caused the difference. So it makes sense to take small steps in a way. So I really argue for unoriginal small step research, And I know this sounds crazy if you think that, of course, we have to be, ambitious, original, excellent. But really, we have to balance that in any case. Maybe do one study like that and one study in another way.
Yeah, this is maybe a nice follow-up question. Also, because this was being addressed in our first seminar, that in the panel discussion, and one of the things was being raised, that incremental research, so building step by little step, that was important. But also an issue was being addressed related to that, and maybe and you can give your thoughts about that. And that is one of the issues is that mainly funders in their calls, they want to see breakthrough research or really innovative research. Sure. And so if a plea is to build on existing research, replicate or reproduce that kind of research, then to think about a follow-up research, how can you get this kind of research funded?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think it probably shows that in part, this kind of repeating research is really basic research in a way that should be funded, structurally, institutionally, and not by calls for project-based research in a way. I mean, I don't think we should only do repeating research. Obviously, then we tread on one spot in a way, or we move ahead very slowly. But especially in fields where, or at moments, or if your interest is, systematic methodological progress, then that's what you need to do. And so I don't really have a solution for this dilemma, except to say that you need different projects that do different things. But just as an anecdote, and it's half serious, but when I applied for my current position a few years ago, my talk for the candidature was this study on repeating the Spitzer study, so the very old study. So basically, I got my job through this completely unoriginal research approach. But of course, because the meta level is important, so to reflect about what's happening there and to use it, to argue for open science, to compare the strengths and weaknesses of these two approaches, and it's also something that in my field, this kind of research connects traditional research to digital approaches, because we bridge the divide in a way with such a study. So I think in this case, there were lots of things that were still, I mean, I dared to do that because I thought it was worth it. But I don't think this can be generalized. But so as long as you use an original take on this problem of repeating research, I think your research is still worth it. And I think recently we did a panel on reproducible research, and Carina van Dalen from the Huygens Institute reported on a call for funding for reproducible research by the Dutch funding agency. So the funders are taking note of this. And so if you have a methodologically innovative approach to tackling the reproducibility crisis in a given field, then you can get funding for that. But obviously, this is the meta perspective. It's not just saying, okay, I'm going to replicate all the papers in a journal and we'll do nothing else.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe also there is some hope for this kind of research in the light of open science, where researchers are being asked to make their data fair, also deposit it after their research, also deposit your research software, and so to make it also easier that others can really replicate or reproduce your kind of research. And then maybe in this light, I have a last question for you. Sure. And that is, you mentioned that repeatability of research has been questioned in machine learning and natural language processing. Could you maybe expand a little bit on this? Which aspects of these fields are considered to be difficult to replicate? What are these doubts based on?
So, yeah, sure. So we see this maybe in two areas. So one area where this becomes really visible is the NeurIPS conference, so Neural Information Processing Systems conference, and they have instituted, I think, starting last year, as part of their program committee, a reproducibility chair. So someone who is part of the program committee, part of the group that is responsible for setting up the program of the conference, that is exclusively dedicated to this issue. So I think this is an important signal that the problem has arrived in this community. And the second case is from computational literary studies, which is using machine learning methods, text mining methods from computer science and from natural language processing. And there was a paper 2 years ago called The Computational Case Against Computational Literary Studies. And so this was a single researcher called Nancy Da, trying to replicate a dozen papers from computational literary studies. And she basically concluded that so either the results were relevant, but statistically untenable, or so relevant to literary studies, but statistically untenable because the data set is too small, the method is not suitable, etc. Or they were statistically fine, but the results were simply not interesting in terms of literary studies. And I mean, this paper, was a bombshell. There were a lot of reactions to it, and I think lots of reasons to criticize it. But it did show that we have a problem with this in the field, because it was really hard for her to get her hands on the data and the code. Some authors couldn't find it, some authors didn't want to send it, some authors couldn't be contacted, and so it was the field is clearly not ready to enable this kind of research or this kind of checking. And it also means that probably, in peer review, this doesn't happen. The kind of replication doesn't happen because it can't happen. Because in most of the cases, the paper and the code is not there. And to be fair, I think, she was criticized a lot because she made some mistakes and, some assumptions and some very strong statements. But at the core, she was right. There is a problem with this also in digital humanities. And that's why my lesson, in a way, is that this needs to be community-based. We need to organize this as a community effort, as something that happens as part of best practices in the field, not an individual initiative. That nobody can do this. I mean, it's just too much work. So these are two things where I see that this is happening in research using machine learning, in digital humanities, and in connected fields. And it has already changed. I mean, even since that paper, open science has become a lot more common. People are putting their code and their data out a lot more. GitHub, Zenodo is being used a lot for this. So I think there's positive change. And I'm quite optimistic actually about this.
Okay, that's very good. Then maybe we can conclude with this optimism.